because I couldn't help myself, there's a bit of a quiz on the title, the subtitle. The title of the talk is Tolkien's Unfinished Tales at 40. As Mike said, this is the 40th anniversary of the publication of this book. But those three conjunctions there, traffics and discoveries, actions and reactions, limits and renewals, are not mine. I've stolen them from a particular author who's not Tolkien, who also has two more titles that are conjunctions. Let's see if by the end of the talk somebody will have worked out who it is and which of the other two conjunctions I've left out. But yeah, let's see. It's one of those, you either know it or you don't, but don't Google. Let's have some rules. Okay, so 3 years after the publication of the Silmarillion, which revealed Tolkien's mythological vision, informing the background of his much-loved works, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, his son Christopher Tolkien edited and prepared for publication the volume Unfinished Tales of Númenor and Middle-earth. Unfinished Tales is 40 years old this year, just a tad older than me. And I wanted to take that anniversary as an opportunity to revisit this book and think about its significance and its contribution to the entire legendarium. The added element of poignancy here, of course, is that this is also the year of the passing of Christopher Tolkien, Middle-earth's historian and cartographer, whose key role in revealing the breadth and vision of his father's work started in earnest, really, with this book, with Unfinished Tales. Unfinished Tales was originally envisioned as a complementary volume to the Silmarillion, providing readers with additional glimpses into Tolkien's imaginary world and enlarging their understanding of the mythology of Middle-earth. But what it proved to be, in hindsight, was the beginning of one of the most unusual publishing feats of the 20th century, of the 20th century literature, which is the publication of the history of Middle-earth, the 12 volumes of Tolkien's writings which were never finished or prepared for publication in his lifetime, which were presented in a roughly chronological order and edited by Christopher Tolkien. With the addition of Unfinished Tales, these 13 volumes succeed in showing Tolkien's changing vision of his mythology over a span of 60 years. They reveal a body of myths and legends in constant flux and development, which Tolkien referred to as his mythology or his legendarium or the Silmarillion. And this publishing venture stands in many ways in opposition to the fixed and coherent nature of the published Silmarillion in 1977. In contrast to the Silmarillion, in which his intervention attempted to create a completed and cohesive entity, in Unfinished Tales, Christopher Tolkien undertook the role of the editor. He provided commentaries and notes on the numerous fragments and unfinished tales contained in the book, without interfering with the text themselves. And this editorial role, which does not attempt to regularize or homogenize, but rather to celebrate the variations in style, in names, in plots, in characters, in ideas, in Tolkien's ever-developing mythology, is also exactly the style that is adopted in the 12 volumes of the history of Middle-earth. It was, I think, a turning point for Tolkien's scholarship and fandom. The texts of Unfinished Tales do not constitute a coherent whole, unlike Tolkien's vision for the Silmarillion, as it was eventually edited and published by Christopher. Rather, they are a collection of various writings concerned with a mythology, different in form, different in degree of completion, and different in date of composition. And the title is quite an interesting, sort of ambivalent one, because the texts are unfinished in different senses of the word. Some of the narratives are fully developed, but come to an abrupt halt. They're unfinished because they have no end. Some are merely a series of fragments, and some represent changing and alternative ideas about events and characters never decided upon. So they're unfinished in the sense that Tolkien never made up his mind about them. Most of the texts are late in composition, written between the early 1950s, before the completion and publication of The Lord of the Rings, and the late 60s and 70s. And in that respect, the volume of Unfinished Tales belongs chronologically with the last 3 volumes of the history of Middle-earth, which record the post-Lord of the Rings development of the mythology. Now, I can't possibly examine in this talk everything contained in Unfinished Tales. We'll be here all day, and the rest. And I don't want this talk to be just a summary of Unfinished Tales. There's not much point in that. So I'm going to have to be selective, and I have to apologize in advance if I end up not picking the bits that some of you may consider your favorites. You'll have to live with my choices here. So I'm going to focus on the parts of the book that explore the second and the third ages, and I'm going to leave behind Poor Tuor and Turin. And my main reasons for this is that of Tuor and his coming to Gondolin has now been more or less superseded by the publication of The Fall of Gondolin in 2018, while the same is broadly true of Narnia and Húrin, now incorporated in The Children of Húrin, published in 2007. So both of these books are part of what I often think of as the third generation of Tolkien publications, because they offer us non-Middle-earth works that expand our sense of Tolkien's literary output, like the Beowulf book, The Fall of Arthur, or they consolidate parts of the legendarium that were particularly important to Tolkien, hence this focus on the 3 great tales. So if Tolkien's lifetime is the first generation, then the History of Middle-earth, Unfinished Tales, Silmarillion are the second. These are the third. But that's just in my head to make heads or tails of the whole production. And again, by narrowing down my attention on the second and third ages, I still can't cover everything in Unfinished Tales. So I've picked a few focal points. And my focal points will be the tale of Aldarion and Erendis. The second point is going to be Galadriel's hair. Yes, Galadriel's hair. Bear with me. And the way Gandalf is further illuminated as a character and as an archetype. So let me start with Aldarion and Erendis. There's a lovely piece of artwork here from DeviantArt by Amanoa. There's a link there for you to look up further her work or his work. Okay, Aldarion and Erendis. This tale follows a classic world-building text because just before we have the description of the island of Númenor and its accompanying map. But Aldarion and Erendis, the mariner's wife, is just a stunning piece of writing, as different from much Tolkien ever wrote as anything. I have argued before that the texts of Tolkien's legendarium can be divided into 2 different modes of writing, and that's quite broad. First, what I call the mythological texts, and I would include chronicles here. Those texts that give us origin stories, genealogies, etiologies, some of which are on the Titanic or quasi-biblical scale with cosmogonical or cosmological elements, while others are on the legend or folktale level, less majestic, but still recognizably written as traditional stories, often are, with actions and motifs more important than individual characters and their inner worlds. But the second mode is the novelistic texts, such as The Hobbit, such as The Lord of the Rings, but also some of the earliest Númenorial material, like the unfinished Lost Road, the equally unfinished Notion Club papers, and many later writings in which Tolkien clearly zooming in to give us rounded characters and their actions and reactions, as if he's writing a novel in the realistic tradition. Well, Aldarion and Erendis fall squarely, I think, within this second category. Here we have insight into actual real life in Númenor during the period the story takes place in, and rounded characters with all their faults, anxieties, and inner turmoils. This is very much a love story, but it's a love story gone horribly, horribly wrong. There is a visceral and often cringingly honest representation of the battle of the sexes. And for those of you that haven't read it for a while, just to remind you that the tale we have here is that of Aldarion, the heir to the throne of Númenor, a man in love with the sea. He's a renowned mariner, delights in sailing from Númenor to Middle-earth, and that is on one level to forge alliances with and support the elves of Middle-earth, especially the people ruled by Gil-galad at that time. But on another level, because he just can't do otherwise, the sea draws him. It's part of who he is. And Erendis is a woman from a noble family of Númenor who loves her land, Well, the sea doesn't really agree with her. She loves Aldarion and is initially very reluctant to share him with the sea, and eventually finds herself in an impossible situation of there were three of us in this marriage kind. The text is very, very carefully balanced when it comes to assigning blame or pointing to an ultimate cause for the poisonous hatred the story ends with, or at least tends towards ending with. For here we have another of those frustratingly unfinished stories with only a series of notes and sketches for its ending. So Erendis is one of those few female characters in Tolkien's Legendarium who really doesn't fit the stereotype of an ideal, passive, devoted wife. She has a strong mind of her own, but at the same time also a rather damaging all or nothing mentality. Aldarion, on the other hand, is equally proud, will not give up the love of the sea that sustains his spirit. He judges Erendis to be strong enough to reconcile herself with an absentee husband without ever declaring this, but doesn't reckon with the possibility of this strength, her strength, turning against him and looking for paying back perceived humiliation with the same coin. Some very, very strong feelings in this story. The long courtship of the couple, when at times the one or the other is reluctant to be bound or to commit, so both of them are sort of dithering, is telling. And we are informed that it was not the custom of Númenor that the betrothal should last much longer than 3 years. But the betrothal of Aldarion and Erendis lasts 12 years. Even for people with supernaturally long lifespans, and we are told repeatedly that Erendis' heritage means that hers is slightly shorter than Aldarion's, that is a long time to wait. There is something of the Victorian warning against long engagements here. Contemporary Victorian advice manuals noted that sincere affections could be killed by the restraints and irritations of long engagements, pronouncing long engagements as most undesirable. The rivalry between the wife who belongs to the land and the husband who is enamored of the sea in this text has been compared by Tom Shippey to the begrudging marriage between Njord the sea god and Skathi, daughter of the mountain giant, in verses recorded in the Prose Edda. So they both long for different things, one for the sea, the other for the mountains, and they can't find fulfillment solely in each other's company. I would like, however, to propose another possible source or analogue in a text that Tolkien definitely knew, and one which offers the woman's perspective in a very similar situation to that of Aldarion and Erendis. And that is Harp Song of the Dane Women by Rudyard Kipling, one of the poems interspersed in between stories in Puck of Pook's Hill, published in 1906. The poem gives voice to the complaints of the wives of Viking mariners who go out to sea to pursue war and conquest, leaving their wives behind, neglected. The Númenóreans, of course, as I've written before, are linked in more than one way to the Vikings, via their common association with legendary ships and naval prowess and their ship burials. Significantly too, Kipling's song is spoken by the Dane women, just like the subtitle of the Aldarion and Erendis stories, The Mariner's Wife. And here is how Kipling's poem goes. What is a woman that you forsake her, and the hearth-fire and the home acre, to go with the old grey widow-maker? There's a kenning for the sea here, the widow-maker. She has no house to lay a guest in, but one chill bed for all to rest in, that the pale suns and the stray bird nests in. She has no strong white arms to fold you, but the 10 times fingering weed to hold you out on the rocks where the tide has rolled you. Yet when the signs of summer thicken, and the ice breaks, and the birch buds quicken, yearly you turn from our side and sicken. Sicken again for the shouts and the slaughters. You still away to the lapping waters, and look at your ship in her winter quarters. You forget our mirth and talk at the tables, the kine in the shed and the horse in the stables, to pitch her sides and go over her cables. Then you drive out where the storm clouds swallow, and the sound of your oar blades falling hollow is all we have left through the months to follow. Ah, what is a woman that you forsake her, and the hearth fire and the home acre, to go with the old grey widow maker. Now compare these verses with some of the passages from Aldarion and Erendis. Aldarion's father, Menelder, rebukes him. But you are betrothed, and by the laws of Numenor and the right ways of the elder and Edain, a man should not have two wives. You cannot wed the sea, for you are affianced to Erendis. And Erendis schools her daughter Ancalime to beware of men in those words. Again, very, very strong words. Men turn their play into great matters, and great matters into play. They would be craftsmen and lawmasters and heroes all at once, and women to them are but fires on the hearth, for others to tend until they're tired of play in the evening. All things were made for their service. Hills are for quarries, rivers to furnish water or to turn wheels, trees for boards, women for their body's need, or if fair, to adorn their table and hearth. Thus it is on Kaliman, we cannot alter it, for men fashioned Numenor, men, those heroes of old that they sing of their women we hear less, save that they wept when the men were slain. Numenor was to be a rest after war, but if they weary of rest and the place of peace soon, they will go back to their great play, manslaying and war. In many occasions in the text, we also see Aldarion having that itch that the poem describes to go back to the sea as soon as winter is gone. And there are several instances of him sailing with the first signs of spring. Again, the poem very much insists on that. You know, the moment that the winter goes and the snows are melting, you want to go to the sea again. Later on in the text, when the couple have separated, we read that Erendis behaved like a widow. For all intents and purposes, she did feel that the sea was a widowmaker, if we think about it in Kipling's words. At the same time, Aldarion and Erendis is a story that has been read by scholars such as Elizabeth Massa-Hoyam as Tolkien's complex critique of British imperialism. Aldarion's hunger for sea voyages is always linked with commodifying natural resources, such as forests for their wood, and he justifies questionable actions like neglecting his own future kingdom, neglecting his future or present wife, in pursuit of a dream of progress. He's more interested in the glory of Numenor and the power of its king, seeking for, quote, footholds whence they could step to wider dominion. So more conquest. Similarly, Harp Song of the Dane Women has been often read by Kipling scholars as Kipling's critique of excessive empire building when issues at home are ignored. There's a particular historical moment when he wrote it. Having said all of this, Aldarion and Erendis is also memorable for some of the most caustic remarks on masculinity and boyhood, and some of the most understanding and sympathetic comments on the plight of women in a society that doesn't give them equal status as men. So apart from the quotation I just gave a minute ago, in which Erendis enumerates the injustices men inflict upon their wives, we also have Zamin, the old woman who helps out in Erendis' household, who gives young Ancalime a scathing description of what a boy is, because she's been kept, you know, in her mother's house. She's never seen a boy before. A boy, they're breakers and eaters mostly. Makes me always laugh. I've got a young boy, you know, breakers and eaters. Yeah. And also the narrator's knowing comment about absentee fathers and childbirth, I think, is important here. Men, says the narrator, begot children and left them in the care of women when they were troublesome. And though childbirth had less of ills and peril, Numenor was not an earthly paradise, and the weariness of labour or of all making was not taken away. Okay, so that was my first sort of big focal point. Let me now lighten the mood a bit, because Aldarion and Erendis incorporates various degrees of darkness. And turn to conceivably a more frivolous topic, which is, however, important enough for Tolkien to have made a special comment about it. And that's Galadriel's hair. Her hair, yes, her locks and tresses. We actually get a fair amount of information on Galadriel in Unfinished Tales, a lot more than we have in The Lord of the Rings. Some of it completing her story as we know it from The Lord of the Rings and the appendices, others actually contradicting that story, especially when it comes to her choices at important moments of Middle-earth's history and her associated motivations. But I had forgotten how much more information about Galadriel's physical appearance we get from the numerous essays, fragments, and notes. We learn that she was tall beyond measure even of the women of the Noldor, and that her mother name was Nerwen, which means man-maiden. Her height is actually said to be about 6 feet 4 inches, which would be 193 centimeters. I don't understand feet and inches, but centimeters, that means something to me, which is pretty impressive for a woman. The story of Galadriel's hair and its link with the Silmarils is not, I'm sure a lot of people watching now will know this. It's not unknown to Tolkien fans and scholars. In a text of the late 1960s, Tolkien wrote, "Even among the Eldar, she was accounted beautiful, and her hair was held a marvel unmatched. It was golden, like the hair of her father and of her foremother Indis, but richer and more radiant, for its gold was touched by some memory of the star-like silver of her mother. And the elder said that the light of the two trees, Laurelin and Telperion, had been snared in her tresses. Many thought that this saying first gave to Fëanor the thought of imprisoning and blending the light of the trees that later took shape in his hands as the Silmarils. For Fëanor beheld the hair of Galadriel with wonder and delight. He begged 3 times for a tress, but Galadriel would not give him even one hair. These two kinsfolk, the greatest of the Elder of Valinor, were unfriends forever." Gosh, what can hair do? Now, in The Lord of the Rings, all we get is that Galadriel's hair is deep gold, in contrast to Celeborn's hair, which is silver. In Unfinished Tales, this particular moment of obsession with a specific hue of gold in Galadriel's hair, which clearly attracted the attention not only of Gimli, but many eons earlier, though Tolkien retrofitted this scene much later, of Fëanor himself, and was the artistic inspiration for the creation of the Silmarils out of frustrated possessiveness, one would surmise, brought vividly to my mind another artist's obsession with female hair, especially with redheads and blondes, with particularly luxurious and radiant tresses. You probably know who I mean. It's Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and actually many of his pre-Raphaelite colleagues, to be fair. It's not just him, they were all slightly obsessed with hair, let's face it. Rossetti's red-haired models are perhaps better known, Lizzie Siddal for once. But among the auburn or golden-haired ones, this description of Galadriel's hair brought to my mind those two. Here on the left we have Annie Miller as Helen of Troy. Look at how her hair here can easily be described as richer and more radiant than just golden. And Fanny Conforth here depicting Lady Lilith in Jewish tradition, the rebellious first wife of Adam before Eve, who turned into a demon. Notice how both of these women who possess luxurious, radiant golden hair are also presented as sensual and alluring, actually sexualized, and their hair fetishized. They're casted as legendary femme fatales. Think about the figures of legend or folklore that they are embodying. Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships to their doom in Troy, and Lilith, the seductress demon woman, about whom actually Rossetti also wrote a poem, which has something to do with golden hair, and here it is. Of Adam's, it's a sonnet, so it's quite a short one. Of Adam's first wife Lilith it is told, the witch he loved before the gift of Eve, that ere the snakes her sweet tongue could deceive, and her enchanted hair was the first gold. And still she sits, young while the earth is old, and subtly of herself contemplative, draws men to watch the bright net she can weave, till heart and body and life are in its hold. Rose, foxglove, poppy are her flowers, for where is he not found, O Lilith, whom shed scent, and soft-shut fingers and soft sleep shall snare. Lo, at that youth's eyes burned at thy so went thy spell through him, and left his straight neck bent, and round his heart one strangling golden hair. Now, note the details I've highlighted here. Lilith's hair is literally here described as the Earth's first gold, as if her hair became the gold orbs of the Earth. While Galadriel's hair, as we saw, inspires gems and other precious material substance. And Lilith, like Galadriel, is young while the Earth is old. And to bring things back full circle to Galadriel's perilous but fair image in The Lord of the Rings, they both weave nets and enthrall men. Galadriel is the enchantress who weaves nets for innocent victims, at least that's what Eomer thinks, and who ensnares Gimli with her golden tresses, willingly or not, deliberately or not. The last line actually of Rossetti's poem can easily apply to Gimli too. But it is very much like Tolkien to go back and revisit Galadriel's hair and actually hallow it and elevate it into something spiritual, something beyond enchanting attraction and female mystique. Her hair now becomes the inspiration for the Silmarils and combines the holy light of the two trees. There's something much more spiritual about it, really. Having said that, though, Unfinished Tales still offers us evidence of Galadriel's more perilous side, her rebelliousness, her pride, her desire to yield power, her incitement, whether deliberately or not, of male attention. We now hear of Celebrimbor as one of the men who loved or desired her, in addition to Fëanor, Gimli, and of course Celeborn. Right, this was the small interlude before now I turn to the other major character about whom we learn a lot more in Unfinished Tales, especially his origins, his sense of humour, his storytelling prowess, and his smoking tricks, and that's Gandalf. So we have several parts of Unfinished Tales that are relevant here. The quest of Erebor and extracts from earlier versions of that tale. A number of connected notes presented as concerning Gandalf, Saruman and the Shire. And perhaps more importantly, the essay, the Istari. The Quest of Erebor is Gandalf's own narrative of how he arranged the unexpected party at Bag End, where the dwarves persuaded Bilbo Baggins to follow them, and the adventures of the Hobbit began. We get a very good sense here of Gandalf as someone who's thinking strategically on the one hand. Clearly Smaug has been bugging him as an issue to be sorted for a while, and he's grown suspicions that something bigger is looming in Middle-earth. So he's strategic on the one hand, but also he's someone who's just trusting to chance and may not necessarily be able to have an overview of everything. And that's something he seems to be reconciled with. And perhaps that's one of the biggest lessons of the Third Age of Middle-earth. And this idea that we can only see and understand facets of what's going on around us. No one ever has a bird's eye view. No one can know everything. Doing our best is all we can actually do. It is ironic, though, that as Gandalf narrates his tale to Frodo, Merry, Pippin and Gimli, he mentions what happened in The Hobbit, at least the event as Bilbo saw them, adding, "The story would sound rather different if I had written it." And in the earlier version, "If I had written the account, it would have sounded rather different." Well, the irony here, I suppose, is that Tolkien did attempt to rewrite The Hobbit completely and recast it in the same mode and voice as The Lord of the Rings. And if we think about how the Quest of Erebor goes as a text, one would think that this might as well have been written by someone like Gandalf. But Tolkien rejected it eventually. This rewrite, this sort of 60s rewrite of The Hobbit, made Bilbo slightly insignificant, made him silly. It changed too much of what The Hobbit had achieved. And that retelling of The Hobbit, by the way, for those of you interested, can be found in John Ratcliffe's The History of the Hobbit. Going back to Gandalf, there's one episode I want to remind you of, which, again, I had completely forgotten about, and which now strikes me as extraordinary and very different to the type of thing Tolkien usually does. And it concerns the halfling's leaf, tobacco, smoking. In Unfinished Tales, we found out more about Saruman's addiction to smoking the Hobbit's tobacco and his attempt to hide it, while chiding Gandalf for the very same practice, the very definition of hypocrisy. we read that a remarkable exchange took place between Saruman and Gandalf during the meeting of the White Council when they were discussing what was to be done about Dol Guldur. So Saruman first chides Gandalf for smoking during the meeting. He sounds like a horrible sort of line manager. When weighty matters are in debate, Mithrandir, I wonder a little that you should play with your toys of fire and smoke while others are in earnest speech. But Gandalf laughed and replied, you would not wonder if you used this herb yourself. You might find that smoke blown out cleared your mind of shadows within. Anyway, it gives patience to listen to error without anger. Yeah, there's an endorsement of smoking many readers would find a bit out of touch today, I suppose, or not. And Saruman responds, you jest, Lord Mithrandir, as is your way. I know well enough that you have become a curious explorer of the small, weeds, wild things and childish folk. Your time is your own to spend if you have nothing worthier to do, and your friends you may make as you please. But to me, the days are too dark for wondrous tales, and I've no time for the symbols of peasants. And then Gandalf does something unexpected, and it's very sort of theatrical, very performative. Gandalf did not laugh again, and he did not answer, but looking keenly at Saruman, he drew on his pipe and sent out a great ring of smoke, with many smaller rings that followed it. Then he put up his hand as if to grasp them, and they vanished. With that, he got up and left Saruman without another word. But Saruman stood for some time silent, and his face was dark with doubt and displeasure. In a rejected note, actually Tolkien, by the narrator's voice, explains what that was all about. It was a strange chance, says the narrator, that being angered by his insolence, Gandalf chose this way of showing to Saruman his suspicion that desire to possess them, the rings, had begun to enter into his policies, and his study of the lore of the ring, and of warning him that they would elude him. So here Gandalf uses smoke rings, a playful element in his character, as we see it in the Lord of the Rings, to issue a challenge to Saruman, completely consciously, perhaps slightly unconsciously, playfully, yet deadly seriously at the same time. Again, here we have a range of Gandalf's character traits condensed in one scene. How much of what he does do we take seriously? How much is calculated and how much is chance? How much of his hand does he reveal, I suppose? Last but not least, I found a section on the Istari, the proper term for the Wizards of Megalith, really repaid careful rereading. In this text, we find out that the wizards came from over the sea out of the uttermost west as emissaries from the Lord of the West, and that sending help to the peoples of Middle-earth in this unobtrusive way was a conscious and deliberate choice from the Valar. So the Valar send their emissaries clad in bodies as of men. And here's what the text tells us. They did that because of the desire to amend the errors of old, especially that they had attempted to guard and seclude the elder by their own might and glory fully revealed, whereas now their emissaries were forbidden to reveal themselves in forms of majesty, or to seek to rule the wills of men and elves by open display of power, but coming in shapes weak and humble, were bidden to advise and persuade men and elves to good, and to seek to unite in love and understanding all those whom Sauron, should he come again, would endeavor to dominate and corrupt. Again, I've highlighted bits here because notice the dichotomies this particular passage sets up. In the first stage, the Valar try to guard, to seclude, to rule by revealing themselves in their true majestic forms. In the third age, the Istari will now attempt to advise, persuade and unite the peoples of Middle-earth through love and understanding in a form that looks down to earth, human. Well, that dichotomy sounds to me very much like the distinction between the Old Testament God, just and all-powerful, but also ruthless in punishment and impossible to defy, versus the New Testament God, Jesus, embodied in a human body, just like the Istari, subject to the fears and pains and weariness of the earth, as the text tells us, but teaching love and forgiveness, advising rather than imposing. Now, I've seen much scholarship that reads Tolkien by a Christian lens, and I've seen colleagues arguing cogently that there are Christ-like characteristics in Gandalf, his self-sacrifice and resurrection being just one. But I can't think of an example of this particular passage being used as evidence, and do tell me if I'm wrong, it's entirely possible. And to be honest, I had a vague recollection of this Istari text myself, but it was the close reading as I prepared for this talk that made it jump out of the page for me. And the passage just below that describes Gandalf specifically rather than all the Istari collectively reinforces this link. It says that merry he could be, and kindly to the young and simple, and yet quick at times to sharp speech and the rebuking of folly. Mostly he journeyed unwearingly on foot. Again, there's a lot of Christ-like characteristics here, that being kind to the young, but at the same time quick to rebuke, and also traveling on foot. Unfinished Tales also offers us further explanations of Gandalf's many names, Mithrandir, Olorin, all of those, including one that is clearly one of Tolkien's linguistic puns, the sort of thing he often refuted, but certainly did a good few times. We read that it would be possible to take Incanus as a Quenya name devised for him, which later became obsolete and was remembered only by the learned. And then Tolkien proposes an etymology. But in the same note, as Christopher tells us, in this note my father referred to the Latin word incanus, grey-haired, in such a way as to suggest that this was the actual origin of his name of Gandalf's when The Lord of the Rings was written, which if true would be very surprising. And at the end of the discussion he remarked that the coincidence in form of the Quenya name and the Latin word must be regarded as an accident. In the same way that Sindarin Orthanc, forked height, happens to coincide with the Anglo-Saxon word Orthanc, canning device, which is the translation of the actual name in the language of the Rohirrim. So Latin incanus, grey-haired, it just happens to be a coincidence with a Quenya equivalent. Well, happens is one word for it. In the same way, I might add that Atalantiae, the Quenya word for the downfall of Númenor, happens to be sounding so similar to Atlantis. And Avalone in Tol Eressëa across the Western Seas happens to sound so very similar to the island of Avalon in the Arthurian legend. Oh well. Okay, let me start wrapping up now. Unfinished Tales is a difficult book to read. There are no two ways about it. There is a lot of authorial and editorial annotation. Its disparate material often frustrates the reader by breaking off before the end is reached, or by complicating the Middle-earth mythos by introducing variant versions of plots and characters. But boy, does it pay off reading and rereading and yet rereading. There is so much in this volume that I could have explored further and may well do in blog posts to come, because I've amassed a ton of notes while preparing for this, such as the origins and projected development of the Druidine, detailed discussion of Middle-earth military formations and war tactics, specific instructions on how to align a Palantir so that you can get it to work properly. And yes, the actual story, if rather brief, of Queen Beruthiel and her cats. What I tried to do this evening is just scratch the surface and gather together some scraps I found interesting, suggestive and fascinating. I have only really noted my own traffics and discoveries around Middle-earth in my reading journey, my actions and reactions while revisiting the text, and tried to note some of the limits and renewals that it offers. Unfinished Tales was originally received as a companion to the Silmarillion, but it now belongs to the Tolkien canon as a work, early in publication but late in chronology, that completes the History of Middle-earth series. Despite its pretty strict scholarly approach to Tolkien's material, in Unfinished Tales, Christopher Tolkien gave us access to some of Tolkien's most beautiful descriptive passages, allows us to see more facets and complexities in well-known and well-loved characters, and provided us with another opportunity to appreciate the breadth of Tolkien's vision in creating his mythology. We were so very lucky for his stewardship. Thank you.
Dimitra, thank you very much indeed for that talk. And a reminder, lots of clapping, lots of noise going on in the chat.
I'm sure.
That's fantastic. So a reminder to everybody, please, if you've got any questions, to raise those in the Q&A, and we'll pass them on to Dimitra. I want to start with one actually from Barney Durrand, who says, I've never found the Silmarillion rewarding to read, despite being a huge fan of Tolkien's novels. If I dived into Unfinished Tales, would I find them a bit more digestible and enjoyable to read relatively?
It's a good question.
Your thought?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think it comes down to that division I was talking about at the beginning, the mythological versus the novelistic. And in many ways, the Silmarillion is all the way through in the mythological mode. It gives you outlines, it takes you through big movements, big historical, mythological, cosmogonical moments. And you don't really get the depth of characterization that you would be used to from The Lord of the Rings. I could never quite honestly say that Unfinished Tales is easier, but some of its narratives are of the same quality, of the same novelistic quality as The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. You do get proper characters, well-rounded, you get dialogue, you get, as you saw, Gandalf's humor, jesting, all of that nuance and all of that sort of realistic representation of a secondary world that we don't really get in the Silmarillion. So in some ways it is, but you might have to be selective and plod on and not give up.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think quite a lot of the comments on the chat agree with that as well. You asked a question right at the beginning. We've had one vote on that. Is it Colin Manlove from Ian Collier?
No, I would have loved it to have been Colin.
Okay, so we need some more.
It's actually, okay, a clue. It's an author I mentioned in the talk.
Okay, there we go. So,
but not Tolkien, clearly.
Okay. So Luke Shelton comments as much as asks, but we're interested in your thoughts. This use of smoke rings with Saruman foils very well with the use of pipe smoking amongst hobbits. While the hobbits typically use it as a means of community, here it's used as a tool of division. Yeah. Your thoughts? Yeah, that's a good point. And in many ways, that's the big division between Gandalf and Saruman more generally, isn't it? I think, again, in the text, gosh, I wish I had my notes in front of me, there is a lovely little one-liner where Tolkien says that Saruman were always more interested in objects, in material things, while Gandalf was always more interested in people. So here we have the exact same thing. It's the companionship of the smoking that Gandalf. The smoking rings with the people.
Exactly. Well, for Saruman, it's a possession thing. It's about trade. It's about and sharing that. He's not very good at sharing these things, really, is he? So yeah, it's a good point.
So the fact that ultimately he bought the pipe weed was actually to stop the hobbits having it.
Exactly. Yeah. To sort of monopolize it. Yeah.
Okay. So question from Marilyn R. Pukila. Dr. Fimi, do you see some resonance in Aldarion and Erendis' story with Tolkien and Edith's own courtship and marriages?
With Tolkien's own, are we talking about his biography? Sorry, Mike, can you repeat that?
Yes, sorry. So resonances between Aldarion and Erendis and Tolkien and Edith's own courtship and marriage.
Courtship and marriage, okay, yeah. That's a tough one to answer. I think it's very difficult not to read anything biographical in this story because it rings so true. It really does ring very, very true. It rings like it is written from experience. There are moments in everybody's marriage where you're just thinking all sorts of very similar things as Aldarion and Erendis are thinking about each other, especially when you've had a tiff or that sort of situation. So part of me is thinking whether we get the ugliest side of a long marriage there, especially this. And interestingly, Tolkien's critiquing a lot the absentee father situation, and although, they hate each other, both Aldarion and Arendis want custody of the child. That's quite an important part of their disagreement towards the end. And I'm wondering at times, is there somebody else that he's thinking about? Is there another, because Tolkien was very much a present father, we know that, and his children have spoke about that a lot. Is there another sort of model that he's thinking about there? I don't know. I wouldn't say that his own courtship is very relevant here, in the sense that the reason why took a while and they were separated were externally imposed. While here Aldarion just can't stop himself from sailing away, and he is actually portrayed very much as torn. He is very, very torn. There's no sort of hypocrisy in his desires to do both things, but clearly it's not going to work.
Anna Van in Sky says, is it Kipling?
Yes, it is Kipling. Well done, Anna. That's excellent. And there's two more, because I was thinking, let's do all of the Kipling conjunctions. So there's traffics and discoveries, actions and reactions, limits and renewals. There's rewards and fairies, but if I gave you that, then you'd know straight away, because that's the sequel to Puck of Books Hill. And the other one, which I nearly used, but I thought it doesn't quite fit, is debits and credits. So there are 5 of them.
Okay. So
and because I've got Kipling in the head at the moment, I'm working on other stuff on Tolkien and clearly Kipling came into this. It sort of worked.
Okay, so let's have a look. From Cami Egan, I'm wondering if there's a useful parallel between the ways Aldarion treats Middle-earth and the way he treats Arendis. He founds port positions in Middle-earth and then leaves them. They deteriorate. He does the same to Arendis. Part of the typical parallel between women and the land.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I'm going to refer you back to Elizabeth Hoyam's article, which very much sort of takes that analogy and explores it very much from a post-colonial perspective, in which the colonized land is often feminized. And I think in some ways that's what Kipling's harp song of the Dane women does. And this is at a point where Kipling, who's usually a pro-empire sort of author, is quite concerned about what's happening back home. So that analogy goes back a long time, and I think it's a pretty straightforward part of that tradition.
We've got one more on Aldarion and Arendis while we're there. Is it possible to suggest that the story of Aldarion and Arendis is slightly inspired by the Old English elegies, the husband's message and the wife's lament?
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure that has been mentioned before. I can't remember now who's written that up. Tom definitely wrote the Old Norse one, but again, that's not unusual to have sort of mythological or legendary or sort of epic stories in which you have this battle of the sexes. You get it in the classical material as well. So yeah, there are many different possibilities there for sources and analogues. I'm not claiming sort of a sole one source. And Tolkien is like that, he tends to merge things.
Okay, so one from Chad High, moving on a little bit. So the transformation and progression of Galadriel as a character has always interested me. Could you talk a little more about the different versions of Galadriel's biography in Unfinished Tales? To the connections to Tolkien's early thoughts on her versus his thoughts on her later in his life?
Yeah. Do you have another day?
No, maybe next year.
Maybe next year. It's a difficult one, that, and I've promised myself I'll never attempt to write that up, because that's the sort of thing that you'll fall into a rabbit hole and you'll never come out of it. Galadriel clearly became more and more important to Tolkien, and again, she's one of those characters, just like I sort of described Gandalf towards the end, who on the one hand is a well-rounded, realistically portrayed character with motivations, with emotions, with an inner life, with conflicts and anxieties and all this. But at the same time, she also fulfills certain sort of macro roles or archetypes, whatever you want to call them. So she's often been analysed as a Virgin Mary sort of image, as part of the Marian tradition, in the same way that Gandalf has been described as a Christ-like, as I said earlier on. So there is a push and pull there. with Galadriel and with Gandalf, I think, in many ways. And again, Anna Small, who might be with us at the moment, has done excellent work on how Tolkien has used this idea of and the word is completely gone out of my head now. It's the biblical idea of this, the symbolic figure who is real, but at the same time is an icon that gets repeated again and again. You get images of that same character in different guises. So that's what complicates, I think, Galadriel a lot. That on the one hand, he's thinking, I need to justify this and I need to justify that, and can she really be, if she is that sort of Marian, hallowed spiritual sort of creature, can she really make these huge mistakes? But at the same time, if she doesn't make these huge mistakes, then why is she there? Why is she where she is? And maybe she's more interested if she's made those mistakes. And I think this back and forth, it's those tangles that Middle-earth mythology never resolved. In some ways, one of those tangles was the orcs. Who are they? Where do they come from? What is their origin? So yes, I think if Tolkien had lived another 10 years, we'd probably have another 10 years worth of dithering and going back and forth and thinking, it's that, it's not, she became too important for him. This isn't a very good answer, but I don't think there is an easy answer to that question.
Well, that's a fine answer. Uinen. Alfredo Moroni says, is the reference to Uinen in the Silmarillion that talks about how Númenóreans respect her as one of the Valar, taken from the tale of Aldarion and the Rendis? Is there a connection there?
Oh, Uinen the whale, right?
No, Uinen. Well, I'm assuming Uinen the sea goddess.
The sea goddess. Yes, sorry. No, the whales. Oh gosh. She changed her name from the Book of Lost Tales to later, and I'm getting muddled now. She is mentioned as. Oh gosh, she's mentioned as the patron of the mariners, and again, you find Tolkien sort of finding himself writing that more novelistic format, and then he realizes that there are gaps about things in people's everyday lives. If you're a mariner in Númenor, who do you look up to? Who do you turn to in terms of models, or sort of possibly we hear that the Númenóreans don't worship in a traditional sort of way, but there is that spiritual link with Valinor, and if there's nobody obvious there, then he'll have to sort of elevate one of the slightly more minor characters into something that will work in that particular context. So I think some of that has to do with the storytelling and the needs of the storytelling at that particular point.
But I guess it always seemed to me quite reasonable that they liked Uinen, because she was the one who could keep Ossé in control, at least to some extent. But and Ossé was a bit more of a threat to their.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Yes.
Okay. So, looking at another question, is the gift of hair in the case of Galadriel and Gimli a political act?
A political act? Oh yes. Well, he doesn't. It's a difficult one. It can be read as a political act. He's clearly smitten. I think from that particular scene, it's pretty obvious that he's not thinking politically. But we don't know what her answer would have been if he hadn't justified himself on the basis of the friendship of the elves and the dwarves, because he asks for the hair. Everybody's taken aback. Whoa, what did he dare ask? And then she asks back, why? What are you going to do with it? And again, I think quite, not thinking politically there, quite, emotionally, he says, I will treasure it. It'll be a sign of friendship. And maybe at that point, that's the thing. I don't know how she would have reacted if that weren't offered. And she is a politically minded lady. She understands the power of alliances. So yeah, it's a very good question, that.
Did she think Feanor was watching?
I'm sorry?
Did she think Feanor was watching?
Yes.
From somewhere?
Yes.
Okay. So we're getting almost out of time. A couple more thoughts. I'm sorry, Hanusia, I'm not going to try and pronounce your surname. Regardless of whether Tolkien could be considered some sort of feminist or a critic of imperialism, the fact that some aspects of his works can be appreciated through such lenses just tells me how rich they were. Like all great art, they resonate with various aspects of those who approach them. More evidence of his genius to my mind. And maybe that's a link to what we're going to talk about later.
Yeah, I think so. I think one. I mean, this is a much bigger sort of conversation, I suppose, but the works that survive, the works that become classics, the works that we still read many years after they were a phenomenon or whatever, are the complex works. I like discussing that with my students as well. The works that are pretty straightforward and can be interpreted in a pretty straightforward and easy way within the historical context, how many of those do we still read? You know, how many of those do still mean something in a different time? The works that are complex and nuanced and self-contradictory as well at times are the ones we want to explore and keep on exploring. And that's Tolkien's very good at complexity.
Indeed, indeed. Dimitra, I think we kind of need to draw it to a close there. I think a measure of the success of your talk is that Barney Durrant, who asked the first question, has since reported that his copy of Unfinished Tales is on the Amazon. So other bookshops are available. So I think that tells us something.
That's great. My job here is done.
Your sales pitch on behalf of Anne Hyman is certainly done. But seriously, it's been fantastic to hear your thoughts on the novel this evening.